Okay, so we're back in the early morning philosophy video watching mode, and I think we're going to try and finish up today with this Robert Sapolsky Kevin Mitchell debate. It's been very interesting. We're pretty near finished with it. After this, lined up in my list of things to check out is the Kevin O'Regan What It Is Like is explained in terms of loss of control and body movements. So that should be very interesting. Some in activism. And then uh, after that, lined up, I'm going to be checking out Levels of Intelligibility, Neoplatonism and 4E Cognitive Science by John Vervaeke, maybe. These are both requests coming in through the channel. So if you have anything you want me to check out, I obviously see things and decide for myself, but I'm interested in taking requests. I have a few more weeks where I'm planning on doing this. Once March hits, it's back to the full time grind. So don't know how much of a commitment I can make to doing as much as I haven't recently, but at least for the next few weeks, I'm going to be full time YouTuber as I have been. So that should be fun. I do have a couple more consciousness lives lined up. March 18th for Matthias Michel, and then Ned Block's coming up probably within a week or of that or so, depending on once I figured the schedule of that out. So that's coming up. Um, I'm always looking for new people to talk to on Consciousness Live, so please feel free to suggest people. And then tomorrow, Thursday, I'll be a guest on the Digital Gnosis channel, talking to him about philosophy of mind, I guess, which seems like it should be fun. And then Friday, February 9th, I'll probably do another office hours with One More Brown. If anyone's interested in that kind of stuff, you could probably catch me live Thursday and Friday, because, why not? Okay, so let's jump right back into this. We were just here in the last part of this. We had made it through Mitchell's questioning of Sapolsky, and it was a pretty interesting exchange. As far as I can tell, Mitchell is trying to argue for some kind of agent causation, as they say in the literature, such that the the subject themselves as a whole entity is in some sense causing their actions. I guess the kind of picture that he has is that the neural systems generate some options, say in a specific case, option A, B, or C, and then the subject chooses between those objects. Uh, the subject can be influenced, but is not determined. This is the point that Mitchell is trying to make, and the part that I've been trying to understand. I don't really understand how this agent level causation is supposed to work in terms of the underlying brain activity and so forth and so on. So I'm very interested to hear some more of this discussion. So let's get on into it.
Switch turns, and I will ask Professor Sapolsky to ask some of his pressing questions. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, the most logical thing at this point is let's continue doing exactly what we're doing, and thus my turn put into a question.
So we're going to return to this perhaps later, but now I have to ask you to switch turns, and I will ask Professor Sapolsky to ask some of his pressing questions. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, the most logical thing at this point is let's continue doing exactly what we're doing, and thus my turn put into a question. So, Kevin, what do you think of that? What do you think of the notion that a large percentage of the time when someone has this incredible intuition that they just made a choice, what they're actually saying is, I cannot imagine all of those threads that brought me to that moment. I could imagine, car accident that wiped out this part of my brain being explanatory, but the fact that not only is there an immediacy, a power that we grant to immediacy, and thus we grant all sorts of special properties to it, but also because it's incredibly complicated, as you say, to discern, to accept, to believe that a whole bunch of threads, many of them millions of years old, as to why we turned into humans instead of turning into redwood trees, and explain things starting there, how all of those collectively explain the immediacy of that moment.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think he's saying the Sapolsky response is basically it's a failure of imagination on our parts, a failure of information, actually. If we had full knowledge of the causal history leading up to this moment, I mean, the large picture causal history going back to the Big Bang, then we would feel the grip of that history and its determining of the thing we're about to do, which we previously thought was, from the inside, felt like it was free. And I think this is a big challenge to the existence of free will if it's predicated on this phenomenology of feeling free. Like there are times when I feel like I'm making a choice. Sapolsky is trying to debunk that by providing an explanation which shows that that feeling must be incorrect. It doesn't really say why we have the feeling, which I guess is an interesting question. But I want to hear Mitchell's response. So let's go back.
Again, I think it comes down to the difference between influences and determinants. So I would see those things as influences. And I would see, in fact, the examples that you cite there of someone with a prefrontal cortex damage or someone given a drug that affects their perception or decision-making, to me, highlight the fact that decision-making is a real thing. Because otherwise, what's the contrast that we're recognizing in that scenario?
Yeah, well, hold on. So in the previous video, yeah, this is not a fair point, I would say, because Sapolsky was trying to make this larger point whereby he was saying, look, in this case where, I forget the exact example, but there's all kinds of examples like this. One of the most tragic is this person who in his mid to late life, who previously had been kind of regular Joe, turned into a really vile criminal. I won't mention the sorts of things he did, but you can sort of imagine they're not great. It turns out, and he went to prison, all that stuff, but it turns out he had a brain tumor in an area of his brain. And when that was removed, these disgusting impulses that he had vanished. He seemed, so they said, it seems like it was just the tumor was somehow affecting him. So he was released. Unbeknownst to everyone, the tumor kind of grew back and he recidivated, started doing these horrible things again. So it's pretty clear that the tumor was the causally responsible agent and not the subject or the self or the sky. So Sapolsky's point is, in that case, we recognize that. And we sort of see, because it's obvious, the one thing that's standing out, which is causing the behavior. So that's the extreme. And then Sapolsky's argument, as I understood it, was there's really no difference between that case and my case right now, choosing to have this cup of coffee as opposed to, a matcha tea or something or nothing at all. The only difference, according to Sapolsky, is that all the thing which is producing that is not so obvious as the brain tumor or the whatever damage. So the contrast that Sapolsky is trying to make is not a contrast. He's trying to make a continuum. He's not trying to say, here's a case where this thing is missing and there are cases where it's there as well. He's trying to say, here's a case where this thing is missing and there's really no difference between this and the ordinary case, except that the thing which is determining is like got blinder, blinking, flashing lights on it, and is pointing at itself, so to speak. But in a normal case, it's not. So I don't know if Mitchell's really addressing that argument. Geez, I'm sounding like I'm turning myself into a determinist. I swear I used to be a libertarian about free will. I still would like to agree with Mitchell. I don't know if he's a libertarian or not, but I do have, like, I think I mentioned this in a previous video. I have always had an affinity with the idea of agent causation and this idea, but I don't really see how it's working out here. So, okay, let's go back to it.
We do, right? We recognize when someone has, schizophrenia or when someone has drug addiction or something like that, that they're not as in control of their behavior as people without those conditions. So for me, if we're recognizing that, that means that there's something that we're talking about, right? This conscious or just general cognitive control of our behavior that can vary between people because it's not a magical thing, right? It doesn't have to have something outside the brain. it's comprised of these systems within our brain. And as I said, just because neuroscience reveals what those systems are, doesn't mean that we're not really using them to do cognition and thinking and decision making. It's not the neural mechanisms. It really is what the patterns that they instantiate mean in the system.
Yeah, of course, but that's besides the point. So I already predict that Sapolsky is just going to say, yeah, but what made those things the way that they are? Because that's his argument over and over. So is Mitchell a compatibilist? I need to find out more. I see there's another talk by him over there. Mitchell on absurdity of denying free will. Huh. These are all the things that compatibilists say.
So
Skip.
for me, those kinds of contrasts really highlight what it is I think should be the focus of attention. These biological systems that are evolved, that don't require any magic, but that do allow individuals to take all of these influences from their past, take all of this knowledge from their past, and according to their own tunings and predispositions and propensities, decide what to do in a given scenario. And I think, this, a lot of times people will say, well, look, in this scenario, you didn't decide what to do, you just did it. And we all recognize there are cases where we're just impulsive, and sometimes we say, why did I do that? That was so stupid. I wish I hadn't done that. Or I wish I hadn't said that, right? Or, ideas pop into our head and we don't know why. But I don't think it's right to extrapolate from those kinds of cases, which some people do, to say that all the time thoughts just pop into our head and we never know where they came from, right? Or all the time we just make decisions and we never know why, because we do know why. We can introspect and we can tell each other, right? We can talk about our reasons. We can think about them.
Okay, so this is somewhat disappointing. Yeah, no one's denying any of this stuff. The question is whether we have any control over it, in a sense that, well, as Sapolsky would put it, is independent of the history of the brain, or in other words, acts outside of the previous causal sequence of events. I mean, I think maybe both these guys are simply assuming that if determinism is really true, it doesn't make sense to talk about decisions and cognition generally, but I don't understand why they would think that. Maybe the ordinary folk psychological notion of choose has some libertarian free will stuff to it. But if it just means there's options and then you weigh reasons and pick one, determinists think that's true. It's just that process is determined. So the choice is made in a way that's determined, says the determinist. So what is going on here? Yeah, I wish someone would bring this up about the issue of compatibilism and the philosophical distinctions in free will literature, so that we would know what these guys were talking about.
We can reconsider them in a this metacognitive kind of a way. So I think we have these faculties that enable us to navigate through the world and guide our behavior through time, that inform how we react to whatever situation we happen to be in a moment, but as a self that has some driving continuity, not just as this reactive kind of mechanism. So I guess I would see those instances where clearly people have less control as evidence that there is control, right? That there's a thing that can be damaged.
Whereas I see circumstances where we can describe to somebody why we made that decision as proving sort of the lack of free will precisely because of the circumstances that could show what's going on beneath the surface. One example, this was a wonderfully interesting paper in Science some years ago, looking at commuters in Boston, some white bread, middle-class suburb commuting every day into Boston, and a whole bunch of like briefcase toting executives or whatever. And an experiment was done, which was every day for 2 weeks, standing on the platform was a well-dressed pair of men who were speaking to each other in Spanish, speaking quietly, holding briefcases, all of that. And this was done every single morning for a number of weeks. And then afterward, the researchers managed to corral those commuters in there and give them a whole questionnaire about opinions about stuff, and compared to the control suburban train station just in the next suburb there, what you saw was the mere presence of these two guys speaking Spanish every day to each other caused a significant increase in hostility towards immigration in the United States. And building on your point, or focusing on it, if you
Did
ask,
that replicate, I wonder? I mean, I do feel like a lot of Sapolsky's work is hinging on, not his work, sorry, the arguments that he's making uh, hinge on these kind of social psych experiments, which I'm not sure how much, how replicated this, like in this particular, I don't know the details of this experiment. I mean, so this is supposed to be an illustration of his point, I think, of the continuum. So on the one end, you have the brain damaged tumor person who's behaving in the way they are because of the tumor, basically, and you can kind of see it directly. And then on the other hand, you have these guys who have certain attitudes about immigration or not, and they may think they've came to those on their own, but really you could sort of trace according to Sapolsky, the origination of that into this manipulation in the environment. So that I think his point is just like there's this continuum, so that when you think, so when Mitchell says, look, there are influences and then we make decisions that are free. Sapolsky's point is, well, they appear to be free, but we can explain like why you did it and therefore dispel this illusion that you like did it freely. I think that's the dialectic here. I mean, I don't know. I have to say, I think Sapolsky's points are clearer, and I don't really understand Mitchell's position, to be honest. Even though I disagree with Sapolsky, and I want to agree with Mitchell. Yeah.
that person, why did you just like give it an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10 about how much of a problem illegal immigration is? They're going to tell you about like our trade imbalance with the Kwakiutl people in northwestern. They're going to confabulate an explanation for their choice rather than being aware of it. Okay, so that's a wonderful, like dramatic, flashy one, but it shows the extent to which our ability to explain our choices sure cannot be a litmus test for like whether free will had just been exercised.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because so again, those kinds of scenarios where sometimes people confabulate, where they may be influenced by things that they don't know about. And I mean, I'll say as an aside that a lot of that sort of social priming literature I just find very dodgy and not convincing, and the whole replication crisis has shown that a lot of it isn't very replicable or robust. But generally speaking, anyway, I'm perfectly happy to accept that things are influencing us that we're not really aware of sometimes, and that we are, some particular decisions may be influenced by those subliminal things. But I don't think that means that all of the time we never have insight into why we do things. And we have very good systems that are designed precisely to inspect our reasons and to think about the way that we're thinking, to judge the confidence level. So when we do something, we can say, did it turn out good or bad? Okay, but why? Why did it turn out bad? Was it because the decision was bad? Because the information wasn't very reliable? Because my source wasn't reliable? So all of those things give us extra cognitive power to be able to predict the world and behave better in some future date. And those systems are very well developed. And if they weren't good, right, if they were always just confabulation and after the fact post hoc rationalization, we wouldn't have them. I mean, if they were so crap that they were not serving an adaptive function, and not just for ourselves, but this whole theory of mind, figuring out what your reasons were, right? I mean, we have these highly developed systems for social cognition to understand our reasons, other people's reasons. That's how we cooperate and get along. So I think you can think like, with optical illusions, for example, there are cases where we have optical illusions, seeing things that are not out in the world. And you could say, well, that shows our visual systems are never reliable. And that's just not a right conclusion to draw. What it shows is that our visual systems are biologically formed systems that have some vulnerabilities to them.
Yeah, that's a weird analogy. So you wouldn't say the case is not whether our systems are reasonable or reliable. I can't talk. Reliable. The question is whether they're determined. So in the visual system, I think the case he just made is that it is, right? Percepts it's underdetermined. Different patterns out there produce the same percept. Interesting. So anyway, I got distracted by thinking about something else. I don't think that the argument of the determinist is or cognitive systems are unreliable. They can be very good at what they do, and there can be different degrees of how good they are at what they do, because that's an irrelevant point to whether they're determined or not. Whether the outcome is an inevitable consequence of the previous states of the system, or the previous states of the environment, or the previous states of the universe, or whatever. So I don't really see, I mean, obviously this point is a good point in terms of like why you're not dead and how come you're still walking around, and other animals too. But it doesn't have anything to do with determinism, does it? I think he has this note. Did I bring this up in the last video about the roulette wheels? Yeah, he thinks like if determinism was true, everything would be kind of automatic and you wouldn't ever have the internal feeling of deliberation or something like that. But that's a very strange way of thinking about determinism. That's not what they're saying. Okay, so this is probably what's supposed to say. Let's see.
And I'm perfectly happy to accept that our cognitive decision-making systems are the same, right? They have some vulnerabilities to them, but I don't think that means we never know what our reasons are or never can trace, a line of our own motivations.
Okay, so to take this scenario up to a meta level, you carry out a behavior, as you said, and then you evaluate it afterward. Was it successful? Was I operating on false information that people gave me? Is this the sort of person I want to be, et cetera, et cetera? And that's important, and sort of your points there make sense. But there's a meta level, which is, how did you become the sort of person who values self-reflection? How did you become the sort of person who valuing self-reflection can actually go and do it instead of watching television at that point? How did you become that sort of person? I think we're in tremendous danger here of reaching common ground.
We might be. Well, actually, I have common ground with you on this. So I think you're concerned about what philosophers call the problem of moral luck. Is absolutely spot on, right? Of course, we should be aware that different people are constituted in ways and have the luck of circumstances and so on that have enabled them to achieve certain.
Yeah, that's moral luck. That's interesting. So, this is an idea that goes back to Thomas Nagel. As far as I know, maybe came before him, but the first time I read about it was in this book, Moral Questions, I think. Wasn't it? Yeah, I think it's in Moral Questions. Anyway, someone correct me down below. What am I going to do? Have instant access to all the information of mankind at my fingertips and look it up? Nah, you can do that. Anyway, Nagel. So Nagel gave some examples. You're walking home, and you instead of going straight, you turn left. So you could, your house is here, so you could go straight and turn left up here, or you could turn left here and go straight over there. So, you make a decision, you go one way or the other. So let's say, unbeknownst to you, that had you gone straight, you would have encountered someone being mugged and had to decide whether to help them or mind your own business. But since you turned left, you never encountered that situation. So, okay, you go home, nothing happens, you think you're a good person, but, it's kind of just luck that if you had gone straight and encountered that mugging, maybe you would have, turned out to be doing something cowardly, like running away, or maybe joining in on the mugging, or try to save the person and become injured or killed or whatever. So, or a hero. So it's kind of just luck that didn't happen. Now, if you had gone the other way and that stuff did happen, then it's kind of just luck that you were in the right circumstance where you could either showcase your heroism or have a spotlight shined on your cowardice. So, some people have made a big deal about this, that you could live a perfectly good life and do things that are really good, but, I guess the old joke in the old days was that, someone's only as faithful as their options. So it's like, if you're a faithful spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, that may just be because you've never had the opportunity to cheat. So that's just lucky. Are we really supposed to say you did a good job or something like that? Because who knows, if some hot person you were interested in approached you, you may have succumbed. And it's just luck that never happened. It's either good luck or bad luck. Anyway, so Is that really the same issue though as the one that Sapolsky is making? Because he's saying it's more than just luck; it's determined. So I don't know if this is a fair comparison. Um, Interesting.
Or that have led them, down a path towards, antisocial behavior or criminal behavior or whatever it is, addiction, and so on. So I'm completely on board with that. And I think, especially in the American system, which, speaking as an American, excuse me, but one who hasn't lived there in a while, is, extremely unfair society. And yet it has this myth of meritocracy, right? And so I agree that just goes way too far. And that we absolutely should take people's answers into account when we're judging them, if judging people is a thing we want to do at all. I just don't think it's 100%, right? I still think there's some involvement of the person as we go along, including, I would say, and this sounds old-fashioned, some sort of cumulative involvement in the way that our own character develops. Because the idea that right now the way we're configured, we have no influence over that, is only true if your claim that we never make a choice at all is true, right? So it's a sort of a circular argument. If, as we go along, we really are making choices, then the way we are right now is partly a result of those choices that we've made. And so, I think we can still rescue the idea of responsibility in the moment and responsibility for our character through time without saying it's 100% responsibility and we shouldn't take any other factors into account.
Okay.
I don't really see how you're going to walk that line there. I would love to. This is the line that I would like to walk. I think this is a common sense view that Mitchell is supporting here, but I don't really see him addressing the arguments of Sapolsky. He's kind of just saying, I would like for this other view to be true, and you haven't conclusively shown that it isn't. Okay.
So what a drag. We're in agreement here.
Right.
In that sort of early on in the book, I say, I happen to believe there's no free will whatsoever, but I recognize that's sort of a lunatic fringe stance. And I'll be perfectly happy if the book convinces readers that there's a lot less free will than conventionally thought, maybe placed in the context of how you phrased it, that there's a whole lot stronger influences. And my conclusion there would be that, yeah, maybe there is a little free will, but there's so much less of it than we think there is, that people need to think differently about certain things. They need to completely trash the notion of blame and punishment. They also need to completely trash the notion of praise and reward. And they have to completely trash notions like feeling entitled about something.
Well, if there's a little bit of free will, then you don't have to completely trash them, obviously. But so I think it's the kind of free will he's admitting, this kind of dualism free will outside, or is it just compatibilism? Interesting. I mean, this is where I think the work of people like Greg Caruso is really important, because he argues that you can have a different model of punishment, not one for retribution, but one of the way you treat contagious persons in society, you quarantine them. So he has this social quarantine model. I forget what his name of it is, but anyway, it's very interesting. Okay.
And I think that's sort of the logical outcome of even being willing to concede we don't have enough knowledge at this point about the gears underneath the surface to say precisely why this happened, but we can see enough of what preceding antecedent causes produces in terms of outcomes to know that our view of how the world should be run and judged is desperately wrong.
Yeah, so I would agree with you, except for the completely trash bit. So completely trash our justice system, or completely trash our ways of judging praise and blame and so on. Where I would say revise and nuance them in important ways. But one question though is, don't you think we already do that? I mean, doesn't the legal system, maybe this varies by jurisdiction, but doesn't it already take into account the fact that different people have different circumstances? I mean, we take into account very clearly mental competence, if somebody's prefrontal cortex was damaged, or if they were inebriated, or if they're only a child, or if they have dementia. It feels like the legal system already does that. It recognizes that we have some degrees of freedom, but some people have more than others, either because of external things or internal constitution at the moment. So is such a radical proposal really needed?
Yes, because we're in a realm. I think what we're seeing is, both you and I are subjects of our place and time. If it were 400 years ago, you and I being just as reflective and having the same synapses that we do right now, etc., there's a good chance that both of us would have an intuitive sense that some people are meant to be slaves. They're simply not capable of taking care of themselves. And in fact, it's benevolence on your part to enslave them. And that would make intuitive sense. And now, because we're in this place and time, that makes intuitive sense that that's the most appalling thing imaginable. And what we're seeing at any given point is
I mean,
there are
sadly, that was Aristotle's view. Although the kind of slavery he had in mind was not like chattel slavery of our time, which is horrid. I mean, any kind of slavery is horrid, but well, Aristotle did have this view that there were so-called natural slaves, which were people that, I mean, his kind of intuitive view was that there's the brains of the operation and the muscles of the operation. And so if you're a natural born slave, then you're kind of, just a brute with not so much intelligence, perhaps. And Aristotle thought you should be doing manual labor, whereas if and that's not a big deal according to him. So that was the intuitive idea. It's a weird thing to say nowadays, and this is the point that Sapolsky's making, is that over time these things change, and that he wants to work towards a society where this is like there's a lot of change, maybe even as big as this on a societal scale.
things of that sort that made intuitive sense to me 40 years ago.
By the way, not everyone agreed with this Aristotelian view, so I don't know if we would all be sitting around like he says. Some people didn't agree with it and disagree with Aristotle, but a lot of people did agree, and it was a kind of a common view at the time.
Seem appalling, and there will be things 40 years hence. And I would say that at this point, when we are doing an edge case, there was brain damage, or there was such appalling childhood abuse over and over and over that we can see the size of those threads. All we're doing is proving that things that will become intuitively unacceptable at some point in the future seem okay right now. And we know enough to know that so much of what we are doing right now is not okay.
Yeah.
And so much so that trashing does not constitute a frenzied over-the-top word to use in that context.
Yeah, no, I see the point. And I would say, I mean, you could take, for example, the use of the death penalty as one of those things which many people in the future would be horrified by. We know that's the case because many people in the rest of the world outside countries that have the death penalty are horrified by it. I guess my final point would be, I think you can.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was young, I was pro death penalty, but as I grew older, I realized that I'm pro death penalty in theory, but in practice, I'm against the death penalty because of how fucked up our system is, and the possibility of errors and how tragic that shit is. So now I'm against it in practice, even though in principle I agree that if like idealist society existed and certain crimes were committed, then the appropriate punishment might be death. But I don't think in any real society that you could ever reach those standards. So I've become more nuanced over time. But I think he's right that the idea of death as a punishment at all seems barbaric in a way. I mean, Kant's argument was that some crimes are so horrific that if you want to make the punishment match the crime, then it has to be something as horrific. But we don't agree with that anymore nowadays, I would say, right? So this is one of the points that they're making. These things change over time. So probably in 100 years, hopefully death penalty will be considered an archaic tradition of the past. I mean, what will they do instead? Implant the correct neural circuitry to make them. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting issues here. They're not really bringing up but about in the legal system. For example, one interesting case was a cocaine addict who was ordered to take some medication that would stem his cocaine addiction upon his release, but he fought it and said, well, you can't, I don't consent to this. And so he won. He didn't have to take medication. He got out and obviously did cocaine and crime spree. So the questions of autonomy of the self are central to the justice system, even though it recognizes these fringe cases. I think this is kind of Sapolsky's point. It's like if we really realized how deep this stuff goes, then we might revise some of these judgments that we have about whether this individual should have been mandated to take this drug or not, whether their consent was, truly informed or free or something like that. When they said, no, I don't want to take this medication that will stem my craving for cocaine or whatever the drug is. So, yeah, interesting. Okay, so this is getting, I thought we were going to make it through the rest of this. Let's at least make it through this section. Maybe I'll come back for the final ending section.
Make all those arguments without having them rest on this absolute metaphysical question. I don't think we have to go to the absolute version of no free will whatsoever in order to justify making those arguments, because you and I both agree there's all these sorts of influences at play that we should take into account and should change the way that we think about people's behavior and their degree of responsibility for it, but in I would say in a more subtle way that's much more sort of context sensitive and dependent.
Okay, and I would end by saying that makes total sense as long as we keep thinking our intuitions of what's intuitively obvious right now are not going to stand the test of time and will seem as alien in the future as people thinking that lightning storms are caused by old women who do witchcraft sort of thing. But at the moment, okay, in order to be a good house guest here, if we can agree on a conclusion, yeah, if you want to claim there was free will in why you decided to brush your top teeth before your bottom teeth this morning rather than the other way around, go for it. I think I can grant that. But knowing nonetheless there's a good chance, for reasons I can't even begin to imagine, that will seem appallingly unfair to attribute that to free will at some point among our great-great-grandchildren.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you both for this back and forth. I mean, I really enjoyed it.
Okay, very interesting. All right, so let's go ahead and pause here. It's already getting kind of long. It's an interesting discussion. It left me a bit unsatisfied as far as Mitchell's position goes. So I don't really understand it. Which is frustrating because I think I want to agree with him. I don't understand why he thinks what he does or how it fits with what he's saying. So anyway, there's more work to be done here. My area and interest primarily is in consciousness, and free will comes up here and there in the consciousness discussions, but I don't really work in that area. So I have to even though I have strong intuitions about free will, I have to I'm gonna have to think about this more. Anyway, okay, so should I just sit here on camera for 20 minutes and think about it? I'm out later, guys.